Test it.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have this very special conversation. I know just a formal intro, because we don't really need an intro, to Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue. But before I do an intro, I just want to say that it's really an honor and a pleasure to have Rabbi Cosgrove come home, because every Shabbat, your parents quiz me on what you said 3 hours before us. And so the fact that I can hear you just right now, we can all know what you're saying. And it's just amazing to have you here and not just say that you're here on a Shabbat morning. So welcome home. Thank you. Just as a quick bio, because it is worth reading, all the accolades that Rabbi Cosgrove has done so far in his amazing distinguished rabbinic career. Leading voice of American Jewry, senior rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, ordained in 1999 at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, doctorate at the University of Chicago Divinity School, a senior Hartman Rabbinic Fellow, sits on the Chancellor's Cabinet of the Jewish Theological Seminary, editorial board of Masorati, the New Journal of Conservative Judaism, officer of the New York Board of Rabbis, serves on the boards of UJA Federation of New York, American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and Hillel at the University of Michigan, which I want to talk about later. A member of the Council of Foreign Relations, he has represented the Jewish community at the National 9/11 Memorial during the visit of Pope Francis in 2015. Frequent contributor to Jewish journals, periodicals, author of 16 volumes of sermons, editor of Jewish Theology in Our Time, and the author of For Such a Time as This on Being Jewish Today, which I know many of you already have. The host of Conversations with Cosgrove, a podcast featuring sermons, conversations, and selected programs. And for Rabbi Guzik and I and so many rabbis in this country, really a rabbi's rabbi and just a wonderful, wonderful friend. Thank you for being here. Rabbi Cosgrove said we should start with a softball. I prefer the basketball.
Before we do this, can I just say what an honor it is to be here? I mean, I was bar mitzvahed on this pulpit. And actually half of you, raise your hand if you were at my bar mitzvah. The Camersons, the Hymans, the Orlanskis, right? The Grews, everyone. My brothers, their wives, they weren't married to them yet, but you all did really well for yourselves. It's amazing to be here. My Jewish journey, my Jewish identity is rooted in this building at what was then called Akiba Academy. Not a small amount of money has been invested in my Jewish education. Rivka Shaked, my first grade Hebrew teacher, remains like the greatest Jewish educator that I ever had. And to see the people who are here, and the people I know, the people I don't know, and most of all, my parents, because the most important as Akiba was, important as growing up sitting there in synagogue week in and week out, the most important Jewish institution, which we might get to in our dialogue, is the home. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that to not acknowledge the builders of that home for me and my brothers would be amiss. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for everything you've invested in us and our Jewish identities. Thank you. And I also just want to point out what an extraordinary pleasure it is and a joy as a colleague to know that Sinai Temple is in the good hands of Rabbi Sherman and Rabbi Guzik, some of my best ideas I steal actively from them, and there are actually, maybe we'll get into this in our dialogue, but we have had, we're now actively, it's not just our interns that are now employed here, but it is actually some programmatic things that we're doing together. They call Park Avenue Synagogue the Sinai Temple of the East Coast, and it's great to be celebrating your tenure here, Rabbi.
There are some board members here, and just want to say, we'll get to the book soon, but when you go to the board and you say, well, Park Avenue does it, passes with ease, so thank you. Let's get to the book, because this was written or published post-October 7th, but it was obviously information before. You've been speaking about American Jewry, where we were, and if you have read it so far, it's where we were, where we are, and where we're going to be. So maybe let's start about where we were and what motivated you to actually put this on paper and travel the country to share.
So the name of the book is For Such a Time as This, On Being Jewish Today. And if you know your book of Esther, oh, the Mandels are here too. If you know your book of Esther, then you know that the story is a story of a Jewish community in ancient Persia who believe themselves to be at ease in their non-Jewish secular diaspora existence. They thought they had the going good, and then, of course, Esther, whose Hebrew name means to hide, the same Hebrew word as to hide, enters into the king's palace, and she hides her Jewish identity, and she rises up first, as queen to the highest ranks of Persian society. And then, of course, the decree of Haman comes down, and the fate of the Jews is on the line. And Mordecai, her uncle, by way of an emissary, reaches out to her, and says, you won't escape this decree of Haman, and who knows if it was not for such a time as this that you've arrived at your royal station. And so the book is using that as sort of the biblical spine for what transpired to American Jews on October 7th. Now, we'll get into this. Of course, some of the things about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism existed before October 7th, but I think that the narrative was that American Jewry believed itself to be an exception to the rule. We know what happens, and that there's anti-Semitism in Europe. We know about Khomeini. We know that for thousands of years there have been inhospitable environments for the Jewish people. But American Jews, many believed that we were the exception to the rule. And like the book of Esther, we woke up to the reality that maybe it ain't so. And that was a wake-up call. And in that moment of trauma, because the horrific acts of October 7th weren't perpetrated just against Israelis, but they were against Jews, and they were against, frankly, any human being of conscience, that was a wake-up call that also prompted us to find our Esther moment. For me, it turned into the last, what are we now, 435 days since then? So advocacy, activism, philanthropy, and one of the tools that I have in my quiver is writing and speaking. And so given the opportunity to write about this moment in time, that's how I chose to, that was my lane. But I really think if we were to go around this room, we would see that many of us, in the face of trauma, have risen up Queen Esther-like to the demands of the hour.
So you wrote that we are traumatized but not paralyzed. Take us through how we get over the trauma, which we are not over, but are not paralyzed to continuing, as we say, right? Most Israelis say we're still living in October 7th. How do we get to the non-paralysis piece?
So I think for everyone it's going to be different. For me, it was a moment in time where we were really thrown on our heels, that Israel attacked in that moment was thrust within a matter of hours into aggressor. And whether that wasn't just on college campuses or social media, it was everywhere. And so for many people...
New York and Times Square, right?
Yeah, New York, Times Square. So that prompted advocacy, that prompted philanthropy, right? That first Friday night, and I described this moment in the book, that we all took out our cell phones and QR codes, and I spent not a small amount of my time raising money, and I set the goal of $18 million in that very first week for trauma relief to help those who were most needy. And however proud I am at the response of the community, now we know it's just a drop in the bucket. So that feeling of let's not stand still. Let's find out. It could be water cooler conversations. There were some Wall Street firms that had dialogues of allies against anti-Semitism. I don't know about you, Rabbi, there's been an entire new chapter of my rabbinate that's opened up about dealing what's happening on the college campuses in New York. The Harvard Westlakes, Crossroads, Windwards. In New York, we have Dalton and Horace Mann and all the other schools of serving as advocacy for those Jewish families that find themselves looking for support in the secular school system. So there's been no shortage of things to do in these last few years.
And so let's talk about the hyphen, because that's one of your chapters in the beginning. Jewish, American, American Jew, as you just said, can't happen here. That was Jonathan Greenblatt's recent book, or it can never happen here. What were you before and what were you after? Were you an American Jew? Were you a Jewish American? You talk about your own family history, that it's sort of a coincidence, if you wish, that you came with your parents here. You could have been in England when you're Benjamin Anthony, who's been here many times. Spoke about his sort of trauma with anti-Semitism. How would you define yourself pre and post in terms of American Jew, Jewish American? Has that shifted, and should it shift for other people too?
Look, I think one of the subplots of October 7th was, for many people, there was a sense of, where did this come from? And I tell the story of a young professional walking into my office who said, the stories that my parents used to tell me about anti-Semitism and the need for Israel as a place of refuge, I thought they were delusional. And now I feel I was the one who was delusional. So I think there were some, and I would probably put myself in that category, who felt a sense of whiplash, of I knew there was anti-Semitism. I knew my parents spoke about it in their European experience. I know we all know about it in our shared historical experience, but I didn't actively experience anti-Semitism growing up, going to Harvard and going to Crossroads and graduating. It's during a certain moment of Los Angeles Jewish life. Anti-Semitism was not an active part of my life, so this American Jewish identity was something that I took pride in, right? There's a melting pot concept, the idea that we allied our differences, and then the hyphen of the hyphenated identity is that there are Asian Americans, there's evangelical Americans, there's African Americans, there's all sorts of Americans, and there's Jewish Americans, and we each play our own instrument, and that's what makes the symphony of America, America, that we celebrate our differences, and we're an inclusive big tent sort of world. But I think, and Mom and Dad are here, so, but I won't put them on the spot. But my mom still sounds like she just got off the boat from England.
That's written in the book too.
And that sense, there was some sense of, no, I told you so, right? That the last 70 years was the exception, and now it's just a reversion to the norm of what's always been the case for the Jewish people. And so I think that is a difference. The events of October 7th were experienced differently generationally, or perhaps depending on our lived experience.
And so you speak about the difference between Jews and Judaism. And you have a quote from Salah Baron, the great historian: "What is good for the Jews is not necessarily good for Judaism." How would he think about that today? What is good for the Jews today? And you talk a lot about Judaism, because you often say that we've sort of, our younger generation perhaps, lost our Judaism, but we are proud Jews. Talk about that distinction and where you also think we need to go for that.
Look, the story of American Judaism, the story of conservative Judaism, this is a historic, why does Sinai Temple exist? Why do any of the great conservative synagogues of America exist? It's because largely the immigrant population from the Old World came over in the time of mass immigration through Ellis Island, Galveston, and otherwise, and they acclimated not just geographically, but culturally and linguistically and socioeconomically and educational achievements onto American shores, and they also acclimated religiously. And so conservative Judaism, America was a place where an old world religion could be translated into a new environment, and we could find that balance between old world tradition and the new world. So the calling card of the conservative movement is tradition and change. Well, P.S., we successfully made that journey. The challenge of contemporary synagogues is not to help the immigrant Jew acclimate to American shores. It's to explain to the assimilated Jew why living Jewishly should be a compelling thing in a world of choice, which I have a few chapters on in the book. When it's purely a voluntary experience, and you can opt in or opt out of Jewish life without facing any deleterious social consequence, what are the teeth that are going to keep me living Jewishly? And so given that backdrop, we can all sit here and say, wow, America has been great for the Jews, but has it been great for Judaism? And that is a question that I think your rabbinate and my rabbinate struggle with every day. I don't think either of us are looking to return back to the shtetl. Right. We don't want a ghetto existence. And at the same time, we want people to feel close connection to tradition, to community, and to their faith.
And so do you think it's reversed? Because I know our membership numbers are up, and we like to say it's because of amazing clergy and music and everything like that, but...
It's because of you.
Yes. Or the other person who often sits next to me. But do you think right now in a post-October 7th world, it's good for Judaism, but not good for the Jews?
Okay, so this is an idea that we either share. I may have stolen it from you, but it is. There's a Hebrew expression: "Hagonev min haganav patur." The one who steals from the thief is not liable. So that's how rabbis work. So
someone once said.
So Daniel Hartman uses a very useful heuristic. He talks about Genesis Jews and Exodus Jews, and I cite this in the book, and Rabbi Sherman has spoken about it, that Genesis is a very positive Jewish identity, right? God says in chapter 12 of Genesis, "Go forth to the land that I will show you, you shall be a blessing, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed by you." This is the positive expression of what it means to be a Jew. The Exodus expression of what it means to be a Jew, in the very first verses of the book of Exodus, a new Pharaoh arises who did not know Joseph. The Jews are feared. The Jews are considered other, perhaps a fifth column who will emerge from within, and they are therefore oppressed, feared, subjected to servitude. That is not the positive pull of the compelling reasons to be a Jew. That is the negative push of being othered as a Jew. Both ways to define Jewish identity. Now, prior to October 7th, American Jews may or may not have experienced their Judaism as a Genesis expression. People affiliated, however they did, as Jews. On October 7th, we all became Exodus Jews. We all felt ourselves othered by this sense of, the world being turned upside down. We weren't quite sure what to make of the fact, because so much of our Jewish identity is tied into a connectedness to the land, but that very connectedness served to make us othered, sometimes in violent and pernicious ways.
Just want to give a Hakarat Hatov to Avner and Roz Goldstein, who brought Daniel Hartman here for the Goldstein Scholar in Residence, which inspired many of the Hartman conversations here. So thank you, Roz and Avner. I want to go across the pond now, not to England, but to Israel, because it's confusing. So I want to sort of dive deep and then by the end sort of hopefully come out with some clarity.
Right. My goal is to say something so outrageous that when I get on the red-eye plane tonight, everyone in the room will be like, well, at least Rabbi Sherman isn't like that crazy guy.
So this relationship between Israel and America, you speak a lot about maybe even one day making your life in Israel and sort of having that pull. You met your wife in Israel. Even though she's from here, you had that connection. But then you tell this great story of standing next to somebody and when you're on vacation, they were Israeli, you only know because speaking Hebrew, but you never have a conversation with them because you realize that maybe there's nothing in common with us as Jews besides just having this love for the land. So maybe just start to talk about your relationship with the diaspora rabbi and the land of Israel and how you bring that out both to your congregation and to this country. How do we engage?
Yeah, well, there's a paradox. I can't imagine being a Jew without being connected to Israel. For me, it doesn't make sense. I think not to be engaged, and whether you're on the right or on the left, to be a Jew today and not be engaged somehow with Israel is an abdication of Jewish identity.
I want to interrupt for 1 second. When you say engaged, can it be engaged in an anti-Zionist way?
Okay,
Specifically
I'm
for
sure
the young
we'll get
generation?
to that. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Put that in our minds.
But to this question, and I describe in the chapter called An Invisible Thread of the relationship, which is, if you're wondering, a nod to Taylor Swift. That invisible thread of identity is both fundamental to who I am, that there's a connection between my Jewish identity and my Zionism, and this gets into the younger generation, but it's not a substitute for that. So a very telling example is my daughter, who grew up in my home, who went to Jewish day school, who went to Camp Ramah in Ojai, and has very much defined her Jewish identity vis-a-vis the state of Israel, proudly so, went on a gap year in Tel Aviv before she went to university, and in that gap year, surrounded as she was by secular Israelis, she was totally disillusioned by the realization that a secular Israeli spends zero psychic energy thinking about diaspora Jewry. And so you have diaspora, you have secular Israelis, and she felt sort of that there was a betrayal there, right? What's this false bill of goods that I've been sold that I'm supposed to care so much about these folk who don't care at all about me and my condition? And then, actually, and I'm skipping around in the conversation, and then she's told to go back to her liberal college campus and defend the policies of an Israeli government that is far more right-wing than anything she believes in as a progressive liberal Jew, a product of a synagogue like this one, and how she's supposed to square the circle of all of those mixed messages. And then the fastest growing communities in Israel are the Haredi community, the Israeli Arab community, the religious Zionist community, and so I return to the talking point of the fundamental connection to Israel, identity-wise, self-defense, self-determination. You can't have a Jewish identity, I don't believe, without a connection to Israel. And at the same time, you have different Judaism existing that the kids growing up at Daniel Salem's Congregational School are not going to have a Jewish expression that's identified and recognized by the very Israel that they are defending.
And so we talked about your daughter, but I want to talk about your daughter's friend, who I believe in the book you call Maya.
Yes.
Don't know her name, but Maya in the book. And she comes and asks you, I believe, why do you have an Israeli flag on your bima? Take it to that step.
Yeah, so this is a true story. Not that, well, most of my stories are true, but not. Sometimes I stretch the truth a little. But her name's not Maya, but all of my children's friends seem to have four-letter names with two consonants, two vowels, like Neely, Tali, Nava, whatever it is. And so I named this kid Maya, who grew up in my household, was at my kitchen table at any given moment of time, and not a small amount has been invested in her Jewish education, Jewish day school, Jewish camping, Israel experiences, and otherwise. And one night over family dinner, she says, Rabbi Cosgrove, why do you have an Israeli flag on your pulpit? Judaism is not Zionism. Zionism isn't Judaism. And why do you say the prayer for the state of Israel? Because that's a nationalistic expression. That's not a religious expression. And I wouldn't characterize her as a anti-Zionist, but I would say a non-Zionist, non-nationalist expression of Jewish life and living, and of super strong Jewish identity. But finds herself disillusioned by the policies of the Israeli government. And it's an issue. It's a real issue that we have to talk about openly, and is actually debated hotly right now amongst Jewish leadership about what to do with the non-Zionist next generation, what's called the Gen Zers of the Jewish people. Do we exclude them from the Jewish conversation, or do we have a big tent approach to those young minds and souls?
Some of those who want to go into actually Jewish leadership in the rabbinate themselves. Which
I get asked all the time. I mean, I'm involved at JTS. Do we let non-Zionists, anti-Zionists into the Jewish Theological Seminary or AJU or otherwise? Is that a threshold test for future rabbinic leadership? My take on it is you can't blame someone for when they are born, right? If you are 20, 21 years old, if you're a college student right now, in addition to the distancing that I described with my own daughter, the only prime minister you know is Netanyahu. The only policy you know is an expansionist settlement in the West Bank of a prime minister who either is or is beholden to a right-wing expression of Jewish nationalism. The only paradigm you have is a paradigm of Israel as a Goliath to the Palestinian David. That might not be your reality. That's not my reality, but that's the lived reality of a Gen Z Maya generation. And to tell that young mind that they are not allowed to give expression to their dissent with the Israeli government, when on any given Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are expressing their dissent with the Israeli government out of love of country, is simply an argument that I don't believe holds anymore. And so when engaging in conversation, and there's a few nuances here. Some people say, you might not have this, one of the left-wing organizations, but you allow the individual conversation. People nuance it in different ways. I think the most important thing to do is to listen. And because I've found as a parent, and maybe this was my case when I was growing up in my own household, if you tell a child, a developing mind, that a belief of theirs is treif, if you zap them, then you are going to get the opposite effect as you want. At least that's my experience with 4 college-age kids. And so as opposed to saying you can't say that, I recommend asking a probing question. 47% of Israelis, of Jews, live in the land of Israel. They are surrounded by a ring of fire, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, who have said that they would repeat October 7th again and again and again if given the opportunity to do so. Right, what did Golda Meir say? That if the Arabs put down their arms tomorrow, there would be peace tomorrow, but if the Jews put down their arms today, there would be no Israel tomorrow. And then pause and stop talking. Insist that that young, developing mind gives expression to their answer to that conundrum of Jewish safety and security in light of their liberalism and progressive views. Now, let me tell you what I don't think is going to happen. I don't think that young person is going to say, you know what, I'm really glad we had this argument. You're right. I'm wrong. Awesome. That doesn't happen with my kids. Just doesn't happen.
Must be a West Coast thing.
Yeah. But what might happen is that young person might go back to their college campus and might think twice about sitting in an encampment with a placard next to them that says "From the river to the sea." They might be more intentional about how they're going to deploy their Jewish selves to give expression to their liberal values and their concerns for the Jewish people. And so I look long on the Jewish future. I'm a big tent person, both tactically and by nature.
Just want to ask one last question that will open up the conversation, because in terms of the long-term future, Eliyahu, he's our future, or that messianic era. You speak a lot about your family Seder. I can't wait to hear your mom share some of those British songs with us, hopefully this year at our congregational Seder. But you mentioned the beautiful tradition, I believe, that you have at your family, that you introduced, that everybody goes around and pours that grape juice or wine into Eliyahu's cup, because each one of us is part of that redemption. Part 3 is about where we go from here. How are each one of us part of that redemption in a way that will not only help us, but allow somebody else to also take a cup of grape juice and pour it in that cup too?
Thank you, and thank you for reading the book, because I've done these book talks and you clearly got to the end. So normally I'm on the other side interviewing the author in my own synagogue.
I have 2 more pages left because there was a Sinai Kibbutz talent show, but
okay.
Hopefully that was the end.
So look, I think right now this is a time of war, and maybe that'll come up in the Q of A. I think number 1 is to fight the good fight in Israel, in the Middle East. I think the news is changing every day. I think this is a moment for such a time like this where we have to step up to the challenge of defending Israel's standing in however way we can. And for each of us, that's going to be different: advocacy, philanthropy, or otherwise. And number 2 is fighting the fight against anti-Semitism here. So we have to do that. Number 2 is we should not make the mistake of substituting our Judaism for our Zionism. Yes. So the goal, you became a congregational rabbi. You did not become an advocate for AIPAC or J Street or some other worthy pro-Israel organization. So amazing as all your efforts and Sinai Temple's efforts are on the Israel conversation, we want people to light Shabbat candles. We want people to invite each other over for dinner, to come to synagogue, to know how to open a Jewish book, to feel connected to community, right? That's the win, at least of a synagogue. And so one of the wrong turns that I think the organized Jewish community made over time is they made engagement with Israel a vicarious faith to compensate for a paper-thin American Jewish identity. And I think a course correction is in order. And then the third, so if number 1 is to fight the good fight, number 2 is to live a proud Jewish life, number 3 is let's not tear each other apart from within. And that's when I write about Elijah as someone who mediates and moderates debate and dialogue within the Jewish community that whether it's right-wing, left-wing, diaspora, Israel, generation to generation, we don't lack for external enemies. Let's not create internal ones. Like, just stop, right? Everyone is entitled to their view. Let's not rip each other apart from the inside. The model that I recommend is not mine. It comes from Hillel and Shammai. It's appropriate for this moment right before Hanukkah. Hillel and Shammai argued over everything. How to say the Shema, theological issues. Most famously, do you light the menorah from 1 to 8 or 8 to 1? 9 times, 99 times out of 100, Hillel won the argument. There are far more Jewish institutions on campus called Hillel than Shammai. But Hillel didn't win the argument because he was smarter than Shammai. Hillel won the argument because he dignified his counterpart's argument even as he expressed his own. And that expression of humility, of dialogue, involves both speaking and listening. I think we need more of that in the Jewish community.
And the last question, there's been a lot of blessing, and I don't mean that in a light way, but in a real way that has come out of unfortunate tragedy. I know for our community, it's been also interacting with people that we didn't know that were by our side, specifically the Christian community. Any type of blessing that you've seen in your own community since this book has come out, audiences that you've spoken to that are maybe not Jewish audiences that you also didn't realize, like, wow, these people are with us and we are with them.
So no and yes. So not a complicated, not any simple question to end with, but I think you, like I, probably in that moment of post-October 7th, were somewhat disillusioned that we've invested time in Black Jewish relations, evangelical Jewish relations, Latino Jewish relations, the progressive community, and at the moment when the chips were down, many of our allies weren't so allying at that moment of time, and that was hard. That was very hard. And there's been an internal conversation in the alphabet soup of the American community, AJCs, ADLs. Is this a time of shields up, or is this a time of bridge building? I, by nature, am a bridge builder. In writing this book, awesome as it is to be here at Sinai Temple, some of the most gratifying moments are when I'm like speaking to an evangelical church in Texas or Catholic radio in New York, because when I'm speaking to the Jewish curious community, those are conversations where people who are wondering what's going on in these people called the Jews, how can I explain to them why October 7th was so traumatic, why our eye continues to be on the release of the hostages, and why, horrified as we may be at the loss of Palestinian life, we are eyes to the goal of securing Israel as a sovereign Jewish state.
There's a lot to dive into. Could ask a million more questions, but we want to make sure that all of Rabbi Cosgrove's friends and family have an opportunity to also ask. So Amanda has the microphone, and we'll go from there. Eric? Here, Eric, right there. Yeah. Use the microphone so people at home can hear too. And in Dallas.
Hi, thank you for coming. Just reflecting back on what you were saying about the growth of the conservative movement out of World War II as a means to assimilate American Jews into this country. Now that we're at an inflection point post-October 7th, there's a lot of changes. Obviously, the conservative movement has evolved since then, and there's, now that we're at this inflection point, what do you think the conservative movement's vision and message should be today to all the people who are reconnecting? I'm sure people are going to a variety of different kinds of shuls around the country and engaging in other ways, but what should the conservative movement itself, the unique message amongst that variety of different options, what should the conservative movement's message really be today?
So I think the conservative movement needs a fundamental reset. When the history of the last 50 years are written, the most important denomination is not going to be remembered as Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox. Who's been the game changer? Chabad. Why has Chabad been successful? Well, for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they've positioned themselves as the non-judgmental, come-as-you-are expression of Jewish life and living, right? You can eat your lobster bisque on your own time, on your own dime, but when you come in, we're going to dress like we came from Central Casting, and we want you in, we want your donation, but just come as you are. And I think that that recognition of the voluntary nature of American Jewish life, of one soul, one mitzvah at a time, speaks to the lived reality of American Jews. And I think that I consciously do it. I think that sort of inclusive, come-as-you-are messaging, it's not about Reform, Conservative, or Chabad, right? Conservative Jews are fighting for the same market share as Chabad, and they're winning. Chabad's winning, right? And I think I could never be a Chabad rabbi. I don't know if they want me to be a Chabad rabbi, because I believe in this little thing called modernity, right? There are some really fundamentally objectionable things about the theology of Chabad. Egalitarianism, same-sex relations, the soul of the non-Jew, right? There are things that I find really problematic about Chabad. Having said that, I think we can all learn tactically about bringing that acclimated American Jew back into tradition in a non-judgmental, come-as-you-are way. I think that's the message that conservative Judaism needs to take forward.
Mo Howard, our rabbinic intern. If you haven't met Mo Howard, you should. He's amazing.
This part of a 3-team trade, like you get our intern?
No, don't take him. Okay. He's here.
Hi, Rabbi Cosgrove. Thanks for being here, and thank you for your book. I appreciated your anecdote about your daughter feeling, I think you used the word betrayed by her experience in Israel. And I've heard from several people my age, younger, that their experience growing up in Jewish day school, in Hebrew school, and the Israel education that they received left them as an adult, in some sense, feeling betrayed when they learned more of the context of Israeli politics and history, and some of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that they hadn't heard about before. I wonder if you feel that there needs to be more nuance in our education, our Israel education that we're giving to kids, or how you would respond to a young person who came to you with that argument, feeling like they weren't told the whole truth.
I think education when it comes to Israel, like education when it comes to anything, has to be spiraled and thoughtful and intentional, right? So I don't teach first graders, and you don't as an intern, biblical criticism to young kids. That, right? You teach a passion for the Torah, and when they are older, or in this space on Passover, right? You might bring up. That was an inside joke. You might bring up biblical criticism, but there's a time and place, right? I don't tell my children about the people I dated before their mother, at a moment, but I tell them now when they're going through whatever they're going through as young men and women.
Any of them come tonight?
Love is tough. No.
No, okay, just checking.
So too with Israel. I think the responsibility of educating people as far as Zionism is to communicate a passion and a belief in my working definition of Zionism is the right of the Jewish people to their historic indigenous homeland. Now, the problem is that there's another people who have another narrative which is contrary to mine. At some point, I do believe, prior to them arriving on a college campus, this is probably what you're doing with the Barron's Fellow, is to make sure that our students don't hear that counter-narrative for the first time when they arrive on a college campus. But the first step is to build a building block of love and connection to the land.
Michelle?
Hi, thank you for coming. Your book was, I'm only halfway through it, but it's really wonderful so far. You spoke when you were talking about your daughter's experience and how Israelis are, when they are protesting, they're doing it out of a love for the state of Israel. And when there's criticism from my generation and from people who are finding themselves more non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, that criticism doesn't have that love of Israel in it. And so I find myself, even though if I have the same criticisms, feeling like I can't talk about them because I need to protect the love of the land. So what recommendations, what insight do you have about that?
Look, let me try to come at it from my own experience, which is prior to October 7th, the big story of 2023 were the judicial reforms. And I spoke and wrote actively about my belief in Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and that I didn't feel that those judicial reforms were in the best interests of that vision of Israel's founding documents. That was an expression of my Zionism, and the rally that I spoke at, and I spoke at several.
At the UN, right?
At the UN,
Yep.
were in a sea of Israeli flags that began and ended with the singing of a Hatikva. I felt that I was at home expressing my dissent with the Israeli government in the sea of a loving Israeli or pro-Israel community. When Netanyahu, was it this past summer, came and addressed Congress, there were Jews mobilizing. Now, there were different groups to give expression to their disdain for Netanyahu. And I wrote publicly in a left-wing paper that now is absolutely not the time to give voice to your dissent, because you will be standing next to someone who's not expressing a nuanced view on how to get the safe release of the hostages. You are standing next to someone who seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, and your Jewish presence is abetting that person. And so I believe that the calling of the day, which is very hard in a TikTok era, to insist on nuance, to think very, very carefully about how your Jewish self is being used and sometimes misused in support of Israel. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we need to be very thoughtful and intentional about our Jewish voices now.
I have another one. Yeah. And maybe talk about audience just for a moment, because you talk, right? When you give a sermon, it's to hear, as Rabbi Wolpe said, with YouTube and streaming, you can't practice your comedy at the local store. You're automatically on the main stage, no matter if you have a congregation of one or thousands. Based on what you just said, how people perceive, right? You might be speaking to Park Avenue Synagogue, but I'm watching as a Sinai Temple Jew, and another person's watching based on your comments on your live stream as a Christian in Omaha. How do you talk to everybody at once, and how do you sort of divide and conquer in this conversation? How do you talk to somebody knowing that somebody else will take it a different way?
I don't know. I mean,
This is a personal question that I have trouble.
No, it's okay. Just
Private
remember, my advice to you, my advice to myself is that the person in Omaha isn't the one inking your contract. It's, David Aftergood there, or whoever the muckety-muck is in this room who does it. So they can think what they want, and there is a sense of you're representing a Jewish voice beyond the four walls of your institution.
I know you have a very large online audience.
I speak to my community, I speak authentically to myself, and I let the chips fall where they may. It has been interesting. It's been very interesting, like Sinai Temple in these last few months during an election season. I have discovered, I'm sure everyone in your community thinks the same way. In my community, I've discovered that the Upper East Side...
Time to go home, Rabbi Cosgrove.
The Upper East Side, at least, is split politically as to what is and isn't in the best interests of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And it's actually been again, I try to model for my community. I find that I can say anything I want to say as long as I acknowledge that there's someone sitting in the room who thinks exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. So if I say that I think that we have to do X, Y, and Z to get the release of the hostages, but I say that I know Ronnie Gruz thinks, I don't say Ronnie Gruz in the sermon, but I have that image of him in my mind saying, you're totally wrong. So I acknowledge that point of view, and then I say, and Ronnie might walk home and say, Cosgrove's crazy, but at least he sees me and my point of view, and I feel that that's still a place I pray in. And my community. We differ on politics, but he's acknowledged the other side. I'm sticking with that. That's gotten me this far, and it works for me.
And so let's conclude with the breaking of the glass, which is the last paragraph in your book. And why do you share that image as what you want us to, as we close the book, take with us?
Look, we're all broken right now, and we're all broken, and look, literally on the way, right? This book is a pastoral book of how to handle tough situations. I was walking to synagogue tonight, and I was talking to a family who has a bar mitzvah in the first week of January, and the grandparent just died. Right? And this family is trying to make sense, and Rabbi Sherman was there, and he heard the conversation. And this family is trying to make sense of how to express joy in the wake of what they know will be the month following the young man's grandparent passing away. And that, I think, is not exactly like, but it's akin to our own moment. How do we celebrate the joys of Judaism? How do we celebrate the fact that life is precarious and therefore precious and therefore to be enjoyed and celebrated in light of the fact that there's real pain, hurt amongst the global family, and for many of us, for me personally, my nephew on the other side of my family has been in Gaza since October 7th as a soldier in the army. He's a 21-year-old young man. So this isn't some abstract notion of pain in the Jewish family. This is a lived experience in many of our families. So how do we dance at B'nai Mitzvah and dance at weddings, and young people meet each other and teach people the importance of mitzvot, all the while recognizing what's going on? And for me, that closing image of the book is the image of a young couple breaking a glass at a wedding. That even at the moment of joy, we recognize the pain in the world, and that young couple starting their life together never forgets, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. So I think it very much speaks to our collective identity at this time.
As much as I love watching you on stream and reading your articles, there's no substitute for you being right here on your home bima. It's a pleasure to have Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. I hope we continue to this conversation, and as you said earlier, we're excited to begin to partner nationally in leading the way for such a time as this on Being Jewish Today. Have a wonderful night, everyone, and we hope you join us next week on Tuesday with Montana Tucker. Have a great night.